Mr. Vance says he was in contact with President Donald Trump multiple times throughout the negotiations. He also
that there was never an expectation that an agreement could be reached in a single round of talks.
The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America.
2 weeks, just 14 days of so-called peace, and now we're staring at the edge of a much bigger war. After 21 hours of high-stakes negotiations in Islamabad, the world's most powerful players walked out with nothing. No deal, no compromise, just silence and threats. One side claims the enemy has no navy, no air force, no leadership left. The other refuses to back down on nuclear ambitions. Meanwhile, Israel is preparing strikes, China is quietly stepping in, and even NATO is being called weak and irrelevant. So here's the real question. Was this ceasefire ever meant to succeed, or was it just a countdown to something far more dangerous? Stay with me, because what's coming next could change everything. In Islamabad, Pakistan, what the world was told would be a serious attempt at peace turned into something very different, something far more calculated. For 21 straight hours, diplomats from the United States and Iran sat across the table, going back and forth, discussing terms, red lines, and possible compromises. On the surface, it looked like effort. It looked like diplomacy in action. But when it ended, the result was brutally simple. Nothing. No agreement, no framework, no progress. One senior official admitted it clearly, saying, "We've been at it now for 21 hours. The bad news is we have not reached an agreement." That single line tells you everything. This wasn't a breakdown due to confusion or miscommunication. This was a deliberate standoff. Because when negotiations stretch that long, both sides already know the limits. The United States came in with one core demand: absolute long-term assurance that Iran will never pursue a nuclear weapon. Not now, not in 5 years, not ever. And Iran? They didn't give that commitment. Not fully, not clearly, not in a way that satisfied Washington. That's not hesitation, that's positioning. It signals that Iran still wants leverage, still wants room to maneuver, and is not ready to close that door permanently. And here's where it gets serious. You don't sit in a room for nearly a full day, exhausting every diplomatic channel, and then walk away empty-handed unless both sides are already preparing for the next phase. This wasn't a failed attempt at peace. This was both sides testing each other, pushing boundaries, and confirming what they already suspected, that compromise is no longer on the table. Islamabad wasn't the place where peace was lost. It was the place where reality became clear. The talks didn't collapse by accident. They ended exactly where they were always going to, at a dead end that now points directly toward escalation. Back in Washington, D.C., the tone wasn't hopeful. It was hardened, calculated, and unmistakably firm. There was no sign of flexibility, no hint of compromise. Instead, officials made it crystal clear where they stood, stating, "We've made very clear what our red lines are. They have chosen not to accept our terms." That statement isn't just diplomatic language, it's a warning. It signals that the United States is no longer trying to adjust its position to reach a deal. It's setting boundaries and daring the other side to cross them. Because let's be honest, this isn't diplomacy in the traditional sense anymore. This is pre-war positioning. The United States is not asking for temporary limits or short-term restrictions. It wants a permanent shutdown of Iran's nuclear ambitions. Not a pause, not a delay, an end. That's a demand that goes straight to the core of Iran's strategic power. And from Iran's perspective, agreeing to that would mean giving up its biggest bargaining chip on the global stage. So what you're seeing here is not a misunderstanding. It's a clash of long-term strategies. Washington wants certainty and control. Iran wants leverage and independence. And when both sides dig in this deep, negotiations stop being about solutions. They become about signaling strength. Each statement, each refusal is carefully calculated to show resolve, not willingness to bend. Reports from major international coverage suggest that even during the talks, communication with top leadership in Washington remained constant, with updates flowing back and forth as decisions were being made in real time. That tells you something important. This wasn't just a negotiation room making choices. This was a coordinated national stance, backed at the highest level, with no room for improvisation. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When two powerful sides refuse to move even an inch, history shows us what usually comes next. The language becomes sharper, the actions become louder, and the space for diplomacy gets smaller and smaller until it disappears completely. While diplomats were talking in Islamabad, something far more dangerous was unfolding behind the scenes in Tel Aviv. This wasn't about negotiations anymore. This was about targets, timing, and execution. Reports emerging from international coverage revealed that senior Iranian officials were not just being monitored, they were being actively tracked as potential assassination targets. We're talking about high-level figures, key negotiators, people sitting at the table one moment and potentially marked for elimination the next. And here's where it gets even more intense. Israel allegedly had precise coordinates of these individuals, ready for a possible strike. But then, suddenly, a pause. Not a cancellation, just a pause. And that pause didn't come out of nowhere. Pakistan stepped in. According to multiple reports, Islamabad pushed Washington to restrain Israel, arguing that eliminating these officials would completely collapse any remaining diplomatic channel. In simple terms, if you kill the negotiators, you kill the negotiation itself. And for a brief moment, that argument worked. The names were reportedly taken off the target list, but only temporarily, for a matter of days. Now, think about what that means. These individuals weren't safe. They were just delayed targets. That's not de-escalation. That's a ticking clock. And while one hand was holding back, the other was still striking. Around the same time, another senior Iranian military figure, the commander linked to the naval forces, was reportedly killed in an airstrike. This wasn't speculation. It was openly acknowledged by Israeli leadership, reinforcing one clear message. Operations are ongoing, regardless of diplomatic noise. So let's not confuse the situation. This isn't restraint. This is controlled aggression. It's the kind of strategy where pressure is applied just enough to avoid immediate explosion, but never fully released. Targets are identified, plans are drawn, and actions are selectively taken to keep the upper hand without triggering full-scale retaliation, at least not yet. Tel Aviv isn't waiting for talks to succeed or fail. It's preparing for both outcomes at the same time. And when a conflict reaches this level, where negotiations and assassination plans exist side by side, you're no longer looking at a peace process. You're looking at a countdown. Now step back from the battlefield and listen carefully to the language being used, because this is where another war is already in full swing, the propaganda war. You hear statements like, "We win no matter what," "They have no navy," 158 ships underwater, no radar, no air force, their leaders are all dead. That's not just confidence, that's absolute dominance being declared before the dust is even settled. And this is exactly where a serious journalist has to draw the line between fact and exaggeration. Because in real military analysis, outcomes are never that clean. Even the most advanced forces don't wipe out entire capabilities overnight without consequences, resistance, or counter-strategy. Claims like no Navy or no Air Force are not battlefield assessments, they are psychological tools. They are designed to shape perception, not reflect reality. International defense analysts have consistently pointed out that even heavily damaged military structures retain some operational capacity, especially in asymmetric warfare scenarios. So when you hear total victory being announced this early, you have to question the motive behind it. This isn't about informing the public, this is about controlling the narrative. It's about convincing domestic audiences that the fight is already won, and at the same time, sending a message to the opponent. You are finished, you are weak, you have no options left. But history tells us something very different. The louder the victory claims, the more uncertain the actual situation tends to be on the ground. And there's another layer here. These statements aren't just aimed at enemies, they're aimed at you, at the public, at shaping how people think, how they react, and how they justify what might come next. Because when leaders start declaring total victory before a war is officially over, they're not closing the chapter, they're preparing the ground for escalation without resistance. So this isn't a battlefield update, this is narrative control at its sharpest. It's about framing the conflict in a way where any next move, no matter how aggressive, feels justified, even inevitable. And that's the real danger. Not just what's happening on the ground, but how it's being presented to the world. Now shift your focus to Beijing and Tehran, because this is where the entire situation begins to change shape and scale. Up until this point, you could still argue this was a regional crisis, contained between familiar rivals. But the moment statements started circulating that China is preparing weapons to Iran, everything moved into a different category. This is no longer just about the Middle East. This is about global power alignment. And the response came quickly and sharply. If China does that, China's going to have big problems. That's not a diplomatic warning. That's a strategic line being drawn between major powers. Because when a country like China steps in, even indirectly, it alters the entire balance. China doesn't operate impulsively. Its moves are calculated, long-term, and tied to broader geopolitical goals, trade routes, energy security, and influence across Asia and the Middle East. Supporting Iran, even in limited capacity, would signal that Beijing is willing to challenge Western pressure in a much more direct way. And that's where things escalate fast. According to international reporting from multiple global outlets, there have been increasing concerns among Western policymakers about deeper military and logistical ties forming between China and Iran. Even the perception of such cooperation is enough to trigger reactions because it suggests that Iran is no longer standing alone. It has backing, or at least potential backing, from a global heavyweight. This is the moment where the conflict stops being isolated. It becomes layered. What you're seeing is the early stage of a shift from proxy tensions to something much broader, a bloc-style confrontation. On one side, you have the United States and its traditional allies. On the other, a potential alignment that includes Iran and, increasingly, China's strategic interest. And once conflicts begin to organize around blocs instead of individual nations, they become far harder to control. This is how regional wars evolve into global flashpoints, not overnight, not with a single event, but through gradual involvement, calculated partnerships, and escalating warnings. Beijing may not be firing missiles, but its position matters just as much as any battlefield movement, because in modern geopolitics, influence can be as powerful as action. And right now, that influence is starting to tilt the entire equation. Now comes the part that should make everyone uncomfortable, because it's not about enemies anymore, it's about allies. The statement is blunt, almost reckless. We were not helped by NATO. Countries are afraid or weak or cheap. That's not diplomatic language. That's frustration spilling out in public. And when that kind of language is directed at your own alliance, it tells you something is seriously off behind closed doors. NATO, for decades, has been presented as a united front, the backbone of Western military strength. But moments like this expose the cracks, because when pressure rises, unity gets tested. And right now, it's not holding the way it used to. Different countries have different priorities. Some are worried about economic fallout, some fear direct retaliation, and others simply don't want to be dragged into another prolonged conflict. According to international political analysis across multiple Western outlets, divisions within NATO have been growing, especially when it comes to how far to push in conflicts involving Iran and the broader Middle East. So what you're seeing is hesitation, and in geopolitics, hesitation is dangerous, because it creates uncertainty, not just for allies, but for adversaries watching closely. When a major alliance appears divided, it sends a signal that there is no single coordinated response, and that opens the door for more aggressive moves from the other side. This is what a fractured alliance looks like before a major war. Not loud disagreements, not dramatic exits, but quiet reluctance, mixed signals, and public frustration. The kind of situation where leaders start questioning each other's commitment and where collective defense starts to feel conditional. And here's the deeper issue. NATO's strength has always been psychological as much as military. The idea that if one member is challenged, the rest will respond without hesitation. But what happens when that certainty disappears? What happens when countries start calculating risk individually instead of acting as a bloc? Because if NATO hesitates now, at this stage, when tensions are already this high, then what happens if this conflict expands further? What happens if it pulls in more regions, more players, more pressure? Alliances are supposed to stabilize crises, but when the alliance itself starts showing cracks, it doesn't calm the situation, it accelerates it. Let's be honest about what that 2-week ceasefire really was, because calling it peace is misleading at best. This wasn't a pause to calm tensions, it was a window to prepare for what comes next. In modern conflict, ceasefires are rarely about trust or goodwill. They are strategic tools. They create space, not for resolution, but for repositioning, recalculating, and reinforcing. And that's exactly what appears to have happened here. During those 14 days, military movements didn't stop, they adjusted. Forces were likely repositioned, assets relocated, intelligence updated. According to international defense analysis trends, ceasefire periods are often used to strengthen weak points, resupply systems, and quietly move equipment into more advantageous positions. So while headlines were talking about temporary peace, the reality on the ground was much more active, just less visible. At the same time, diplomacy was being tested. Those 21-hour negotiations in Islamabad didn't come out of nowhere. They were part of this same window, a last attempt to measure how far each side was willing to go. Think of it as a pressure test. Both sides entered the talks not necessarily expecting a deal, but trying to read the other side's limits. What would they accept? Where would they refuse? How far can we push before things break? And once those answers became clear, the purpose of the ceasefire was effectively over. Then there's the most unsettling part, target mapping. As we've already seen with reports of assassination lists and precise coordinates, this period was also used to identify high-value targets, track movements, and plan potential operations. That doesn't happen in the middle of chaos. It happens during controlled pauses like this one. So when the ceasefire ended without progress, it didn't fail in the traditional sense. It completed its purpose. Because ceasefires like this don't collapse by accident. They expire by design. They buy time, not peace. And once that time runs out, what follows is rarely calm. It's escalation, already prepared, already calculated, and ready to unfold. And now, as all of this unfolds, it's easy to get lost in the politics, the power games, the statements, and the strategies. But behind every headline, behind every target and every operation, there are real people. Families, cities, lives that don't get a voice in these decisions. Wars aren't just fought on maps. They are felt in homes, in silence, in fear. And that's something no leader ever fully explains. So I want to leave you with this. Where do you think this is heading? Is this controlled pressure, or are we already watching the early stages of something much bigger? Drop your thoughts below. I read them. If you want to understand how conflicts like this shape the global economy and your daily life, watch the previous video on your screen. And if you value sharp, honest breakdowns like this, support the work, subscribe. It's just one click, but it keeps this going.